Gradually, the waters licked up and up the decks, the furnaces belching forth fierce volumes of smoke, as if the great engines were in their last death agony. One by one, the monster funnels melted away as a wax before a flame and crashed upon the decks, till the waters rushed down. Then report after report rang out over the sea, telling of the explosion of the boilers. The waters moved over the decks still, the bows of the ship dipping deeper and deeper into the sea, until the rudders stood straight up from the surface of the water, and poised thus for a few moments, dive perpendicularly into the depths, leaving hardly a ripple behind. Reverend John Fleming. It's November 21st, 1916, and the hospital ship Britannic is mortally wounded. The ship and a complement of medical personnel and crew had been making for Mudros in Greece, with orders to pick up the war's wounded and bring them home to Southampton. 1,066 souls were on board in all, 350 members of the Royal Army Medical Corps, 673 crew, 70 nurses, including a young Violet Jessup, who'd survived the Titanic disaster just 4 years before, 17 young Sea Scouts who volunteered to help with the tasks around the ship, and the vessel's captain, Alfred Bartlett. It was a clear sunny day. The sea was calm, shimmering and placid. Those aboard were spending the morning calmly eating breakfast, preparing to take on soldiers, ensuring all 3,000 beds were made up and supply checklists were complete. Dead ahead, unbeknownst to them all, a German moored contact mine was laying in wait, having just been laid by the submarine U-73 the day before. It was packed with wet gun cotton, armed with 150 kilograms or 330 pounds worth of explosive charge, and needed only the slightest impact with the ship's hull to trigger a devastating explosion. On this particular morning, Violet Jessup, a stewardess who had survived the Titanic disaster, was in the ship's pantry near the dining saloon, readying breakfast for a fellow nurse who'd fallen ill. She recalled the mood among the doctors and the nurses in the dining saloon. Friendly banter filled the air, and the atmosphere was lively and jovial. A teapot in one hand, a plate of butter in the other, she turned to make her way back toward her sick companion's bed, when suddenly the peaceful chatter was replaced by the sound of a sudden, deafening roar. The ship seemed to quake stem to stern, as though in response to pain. Britannic had been hit, though no one knew yet exactly by what. One of the first areas aboard the ship to bear the brunt of the damage from the mine was the barracks rooms on the lower decks near the ship's forepeak, where many members of the Royal Army Medical Corps were housed. In his barrack, on G-deck, Private John Cuthbertson found himself knocked off his feet by a sudden surge of water rushing in from the hole blasted in the ship's side. When he was finally able to orient himself, he found he'd been deposited onto what remained of a staircase on E-deck, a full 2 decks higher. Even closer to the impact site was stoker Bert Smith, who found himself disoriented and covered in coal dust, groping his way around stoke hold 11 before finding himself pinned against a boiler by the sudden deluge. Grasping for anything that would give him purchase, he managed to pull himself along until he found his way to a nearby emergency staircase that led up to the boat deck before he could be swept away entirely by the inrush. In the immediate aftermath of the collision, there had been little in the way of panic on the higher decks, but a sense of confusion reigned. Many of the ship's nurses and crew noticed little more than a loud bang, followed by a shudder when the ship collided with the mine that sealed her fate. In the dining area, where many of the nurses were breakfasting, the shattering of china, as it hit the floor, could be heard, whether it was crockery falling from tables or a teacup slipping from the hands of a startled nurse. At this point, few on board knew exactly what had just happened, and most of the passengers were shocked and confused rather than panicked. Major Harold Priestley of the Royal Army Medical Corps called for calm among the nurses in the dining room, assuring them that until the alarm sounded there was no need to evacuate, and the room settled into a precarious, kind of uneasy quiet. For Violet Jessup, the unnatural calm before the storm was as noticeable as it was unnerving. Having experienced the horror and chaos of Titanic's sinking, she couldn't help but note the vivid contrast to the scene playing out before her. While Titanic had eventually sunk amidst a flurry of drama and panic, the doctors, nurses, and crew members surrounding her had all been trained for this precise situation. Titanic had been a peacetime tragedy, but now, in what was arguably the bloodiest year of the bloodiest war the world had ever seen, there had been a quiet preparedness, if not expectation, of disaster. Then, within moments of the initial shudder, the emergency alarm began to sound, shattering any fleeting notion that crisis had been averted. The dining saloon emptied in a flash. Nurses, who had been calmly enjoying their breakfast just moments before, sprang into action at once, tracking down life jackets, rounding up the few bare essentials they could carry with them, and making for the boat deck with all the practiced efficiency their training had granted them. As it became clearer that all was not well, the theories of a collision with a barge turned to whispers of a torpedo attack from a nearby U-boat. Archie Jewell, a lookout who, like Jessup, had also survived the sinking of Titanic and was now part of the Britannic's crew, was near the site of impact when the explosion had struck. He described the ship shaking, followed by a massive inrush of water and the smell of powder. It was the unmistakable calling card of a naval mine. He would be among the first to realise the true nature of the emergency, though even after the ship was gone, many continued to believe she'd been dealt her fatal blow at the hands of a German U-boat firing a torpedo. 15-year-old George Perman, one of the Sea Scouts helping with tasks around the ship, had been attending to one of the vessel's lifts. After the collision occurred, many instinctively began to prepare to evacuate. George, though, remained behind, dutifully operating the lift he was assigned to, until the Britannic began to list too heavily to continue. When the order to head to the lifeboats was given, he finally abandoned his post and made for the lifeboat station. Another 15-year-old scout, Henry Pope, recalled feeling the ship shudder as he was eating his breakfast. After realizing there had been an impact of some kind, he headed to the purser's station where he'd been assigned, telling Purser Claude Lancaster in a chipper tone, "It's been a big explosion, sir, but I don't think it will do us much harm." Up on the bridge, decisions needed to be made, and fast. Just 10 minutes after the mine had torn a hole in the side of the ship, Britannic had flooded as much as her sister Titanic had in 1 hour. In Titanic's case, flooding had been quickened thanks to the watertight bulkheads not extending any higher than E-deck. In Britannic's case, her inner skin, which had been installed after Titanic's sinking and the lessons that had been learnt from it, only extended as far forward as Boiler Room 6. And while she could have stayed afloat with the first 6 of her compartments flooded, the explosion had destroyed the bulkhead between holds 2 and 3, and the bulkhead between compartments 1 and 2 hadn't fared much better. This, along with the damage inflicted on a watertight door that caused it to jam open in its tracks, allowed a torrent of water to flood throughout the ship's compartments. The Mediterranean was now flowing into Britannic unabated, and within just 2 minutes of the initial explosion, the first 2 cavernous boiler rooms were completely flooded. From his assessment of the damage, Captain Bartlett was hopeful that the ship would ultimately survive, but he realised an evacuation would need to get underway as soon as possible. He ordered the engines stopped, and the watertight doors closed, the lifeboats uncovered and readied. What he didn't realise was that watertight door that refused to close, allowing water to pour in freely. Throughout the ship, 4 long blasts of a whistle could be heard, signifying to everybody aboard that they should all proceed to their lifeboat stations. An SOS went out via the ship's wireless, but no response came. Another message was sent out, then another. Still, there was no reply. The Marconi operators wondered if the apparatus had been damaged in the sinking. If so, the only rescue they could hope for would be from a nearby ship, happening to spot them while passing through the channel. But who knew how long that would take? All the officers and crew could do now was hold their breath and wait. On the bridge, moments after calling for the evacuation, Captain Bartlett was desperate for a saving grace. He spied, some 3 miles distant on the horizon, the island of Kia, igniting the tiniest spark of hope. It hadn't taken long to realise the ship's steering gear had been damaged in the explosion, but with the propellers still functioning, Bartlett reckoned he could use them to steer his ship toward land with hopes of beaching his vessel. The island was tantalisingly close. If Britannic could only stay afloat long enough to make it there, perhaps his ship and its entire complement could be saved. His mind made up, he ordered the engines restarted and the course set for the island, calling to him off in the distance. He ordered the evacuation be paused while he made his gamble, and then he prayed. At the same time, the ship's nurses and medical staff were busy rounding up their valuables, donning their life jackets and making for the boat deck. After helping a fellow nurse to evacuate, Violet Jessup recalled making sure to grab her toothbrush, a luxury she regretted having to do without after having finally been rescued on Carpathia after the sinking of Titanic. As she made for the boat deck with her toothbrush tucked into her apron, she realised that in her rush she had made a costly mistake, the same one she had warned many passengers against in her years spent as a stewardess. By placing her life jacket on over her coat, she would have to struggle to cast off the extra weight if she found herself underwater. She could only hope it wouldn't come to that. "I did not bother to change," she wrote, as I felt reassured that this time there would be room in the lifeboats for all, and I did not expect to be in the water. As the ship once again ploughed ahead, her forward momentum through the water caused the flooding to worsen down below. Now, with her bow dipping lower and lower in the water, Britannic was inching closer to death. Without Bartlett realising it, what he had hoped would be a saving grace was now putting his ship and all on board in a more precarious situation. Meanwhile, as the doctors, the nurses, and the orderlies assembled at their lifeboat stations, there was little in the way of panic or confusion. There were no gunshots or shouts of women and children only, as there had been on Titanic. One Royal Army Medical Corps member later told the press, "I know that women can be brave, but I never dreamed they could rise to such heights of cool, unflinching courage as those nurses did when, under Miss Dowse, the matron, they lined up on deck like so many soldiers and unconcernedly and calmly waited their turn to enter the boats. We men are proud of them, and we can only hope England will hear of their courage. They were magnificent." Officers began calmly loading nurses into their lifeboats, but until the ship's engines were once again stopped, the boats couldn't be safely launched. Nurse Sheila Macbeth Mitchell later recalled, "We were kept hanging over the side for a long time. We did not realise that while we were hanging over the side of the ship, the whole forepart of her was under the water. We might have been more frightened if we had seen it." It was a scene that seemed to exist in sharp contrast to the chaotic evacuation on Titanic just a few years prior. Reverend John Fleming later wrote that the word was soon passed from the boats to draft the men forward in 50s. We took them up thus from the promenade to the boat deck, and when each 50 was counted out, the rest, being ordered to wait, not a man endeavoured to rush, but all quietly awaited their turn. Soon all the men were to their stations and off on the boats. But it wasn't without its difficulties. Britannic had taken on a list so severe, the forward port side davits were now unusable, and no lifeboats could be launched from them. Time was running out to evacuate those still on board. Further aft at the stern, 2 lifeboats were loaded to capacity and launched into the sea by firemen. The captain's orders to halt the evacuation hadn't reached them, nor were the men meant to be in charge of the lifeboats to begin with. Violet Jessup just happened to arrive on the deck in time to find a place in the next lifeboat set to be loaded. It was lowered away, and with the list increasing by the second, lowering the boats down the ship's side and launching them into the water was proving to be a difficult task. The wooden clinker-built boat scraped its way down the steel sides of the ship, the lifeboat falls catching on the frame of an open porthole, and the popping green lanterns that had once lit the ship up as a hospital vessel at night time showered the occupants with broken glass. Some, in the lifeboats already in the water, were now clinging to the falls from which their lifeboats had once hung, terrified. It was a strange sight, in contrast to the orderliness of the rest of the evacuation. The 2 lifeboats that had just been launched ahead of Violet's boat were now in an all-new struggle of their own, fighting against suction that seemed to pull them back in toward the ship. Trying to make sense of the scene, Violet spotted red streaks and pieces of wreckage dotting the water. Then, in a moment of horrific realization, her eyes fell on the culprit. The ship's shining bronze propellers, churning away in an attempt to drive the vessel towards shore, were now rising towards the water's surface, pulling lifeboats in with their powerful suction. The horrifying reality set in. People were escaping a sinking ship only to be immediately faced with a far more gruesome end. Nurse matron Elizabeth Ann Dowse described the horrific scene when she said, "I saw that boat with its poor, pathetic crew get dragged into the churning propellers. I suppose I was shaken to the core, but I could not show this. If I dared reveal fear, it would spread like a brush fire on the veldt. I sat there, emotionless, for what emotion could I have expressed, if not fear and sorrow? While hands pushed and shoved against the ship's side, trying to get the lifeboat away, Jessup turned to see young George Perman, the 15-year-old sea scout who'd been operating one of the ship's lifts, until the final possible moment, clinging to the falls of their own lifeboat, his eyes filled with terror. "I'm not really afraid," he told her. "I'm only doing this to keep the boat steady." On the bridge, Captain Bartlett was still holding out a glimmer of hope for his Hail Mary, pushing the ship at full steam with the horizon seemingly just barely out of reach. He had no idea that on the other end of his ship, the situation was devolving into an all-out bloodbath. Within seconds of the lifeboat having finally hit the water, Violet Jessup quickly found herself alone, save for one doctor. All the others had jumped overboard to escape the gruesome fate that awaited them. It was at this moment that, despite her brush with death at sea just a few years prior, she realised she couldn't actually swim. It was in large part due to having lost a portion of her lung thanks to a childhood illness. The idea of drowning paralysed her, nearly pinned her to the spot where she sat. But with the spinning bronze screws now drawing ever closer to the water's surface and the tiny wooden boat she was in being pulled in closer to them as well with every passing second, she knew it was now or never. With one last gulp of air, she pushed all fear to the furthest corners of her mind and jumped into the water. Captain Bartlett realised his attempts at saving his ship were in vain. Her bow had dipped even deeper into the water, almost in protest, and reports quickly came in that the flooding had now extended all the way up to D-deck. It became clear that he was fighting a losing battle. It was over. Knowing he had done all that he could, he sounded the final alarm to abandon ship. With the forward boiler rooms now completely underwater and the island of Kia still out of reach, it was time to call it quits. Just before the ship's 38-ton propellers could reduce the lifeboat to matchsticks, the engine stopped and the blades slowed to a lazy halt. Unbeknownst to Bartlett, Violet Jessup and many others were fighting for their lives in the water. The ship was now completely stopped, but the ordeal, for many of those who had jumped from their lifeboats, was not yet over. Violet recalled the disorienting feeling of being underwater for the first time in her life, grasping for anything within reach, flailing helplessly to find a way to the surface. She found herself weighed down by her coat, her life jacket stubbornly holding it in place. As she fought for the surface, her head slammed against something hard and unforgiving. Once, then twice, then nearly a third time. It was the bottom of a lifeboat, and the impact had been violent enough to crack her skull. Desperate and disoriented, Violet groped in all directions for anything to hold onto, only to finally feel the fingers of a hand stretched out to meet hers. Suddenly, she later said, "Joy of joys. I touched something, an arm, that moved as mine moved. My fingers gripped it like a vice, but only for a second, until my almost senseless head remembered what is said of the people drowning, that they retain their hold after death, bringing death to another. With that cheering thought, I let go." Finally, she managed to surface, grabbing hold of a life jacket floating nearby, and tasted air once again. She wanted to be grateful to be alive, but upon opening her eyes, the scenes of death and carnage playing out all around her would be enough to haunt her the rest of her life. She later wrote, "All around were heartbreaking scenes of agony, poor limbs wrenched out as if some giant had torn them in his rage. The dead floated by so peacefully now, men coming up only to go down again for the last time, a look of frightful horror on their faces." With the engines now stopped, Captain Bartlett gave the order to First Officer Oliver to take charge of one of the ship's motor launchers to pick up those in the water who had either jumped overboard or narrowly escaped as the propellers smashed their lifeboats to pieces. As the ship began to list more heavily and sink down farther and farther by the head, the launching of the lifeboats became more and more difficult until, eventually, every davit on the ship was useless. 35 of the ship's 48 boats were now in the water, and the rest would go down with her. There was little left to do for those still on board other than to throw any deck chairs, life preservers and furniture they could get their hands on to shipmates in the water and then get away in whatever way they could. Reverend John Fleming described watching the scene play out from his place on a lifeboat. "We could see," he later said, the waves splashing already well over the bows and playing with them, as waves play with the sand dreadnoughts of the children on the beach. Suddenly, the last alarm pealed shrill over the glistening waters, warning all who were still nobly at work below to come on deck. And a little later, the final, solitary, haunting note tolled forth, telling all to forsake the ship. Bartlett remained on the bridge, delivering orders through a megaphone, until the water lapped at his feet. He had held out as long as he could, and it was time to let Britannic go. As was custom, Captain Bartlett thought he would be the final one to leave his ship. He stepped from the starboard bridge wing and into the Agean Sea, swam to a nearby collapsible boat, and then he bore witness to the final plunge of his ship. But Bartlett was not the last man to leave Britannic. A party of engineers came up the ladders from deep below in the vessel's bowels. They'd remained at their posts to the last, and they too jumped away from the sinking liner around the same time, or just after, Bartlett did. With that, the massive steel giant was abandoned completely, and physics took over. Among those also looking on as Britannic went under was 15-year-old Henry Pope, another one of the Sea Scouts who'd been working under Purser Lancaster. He described the sinking with a sense of detached coolness that betrayed his years. "I was sorry," he said, "to see the big ship sink in the bright sunshine, with her starboard side almost on the bottom of the ocean. As the sea swirled into her big funnels, they broke off, one after another with the heavy strain, as if wrenched from the steel plates on the hurricane deck. Her bow hit the bottom of the shallow channeled waters, while her stern rose some 150 feet into the air, as though the ship herself was making one last attempt to defy her end. But her fate was sealed. After a few brief moments, with a sorrowful groan, she rolled over, almost pathetically onto her starboard side, resigning herself to the depths. One by one, her once proud smokestacks peeled themselves off the decks and crashed into the sea below. The sounds of explosions from the boilers came bellowing forth from the lifeless hulk of Britannic as the sea finally swallowed her whole, with the sunlight kissing her goodbye for the last time at 9:07 a.m. "A sense of the desert overwhelmed my soul," wrote John Fleming. "Not long before, one could see nothing but the Britannic. The very hills on the adjacent island seemed small. Now, all that was left of Britain's greatest ship was a score of crowded boats, and a little aimless wreckage on the wave. It took more than 2 long years to build. It represented some 2 million sterling, and it took only 50 minutes for it to go down." HMHS Britannic was gone. All that was left of the great hospital ship was a confetti of wreckage and a handful of filled boats, swimmers awaiting rescue, and floating human remains. But, for a mercy, help was close at hand. Mere moments after the ship had breathed her last, a small flotilla of Greek fishing boats were on the scene to fish survivors from the water and lend what aid they could. Not long after that, the destroyers, HMS Scourge and HMS Heroic, could be seen on the horizon, sparing the survivors the grueling hours of torment that had been endured by those from Titanic. But how had they known to come if the ship's wireless apparatus had been damaged? It was later found that the damage to her wireless only caused failure on the receiving end. Her distress calls had been heard, loud and clear. And in another stroke of good luck, the Heroic had just passed by Britannic 1 hour earlier while leaving the Kia Channel, and turned around to render aid immediately, with Scourge and French tugs Goliath and Polyphemus, plus a nearby trawler, all following close behind. When Britannic foundered, it was far from the nightmare the victims of Titanic had experienced. While Titanic sank during a cold April night with little shipping traffic in the area, Britannic, by contrast, sank on a warm, sunny day, where survivors could quickly be spotted and fished from the waters by nearby ships. Reverend John Fleming later wrote of an officer on board whose young son fervently prayed for the safety of his father and all those aboard the ship, and mused that the prayers of this young boy had prevented the worst from coming to pass. He himself had admitted to taking up the prayer of the man's son, saying that he had prayed that if the ship had to go down, it might be in daylight when the sea was calm and when land was not far away. There may be, he said, some who contend that this was mere coincidence, but many of us who were in the way of trial there felt that God was honouring the simple faith of a little child and teaching us vividly that more things are wrought by prayer than this world dreams of. But the sinking was not without its horrors, the brutality of war being among the most evident. Among the victims were 9 members of the ship's medical personnel, non-combatant forces tasked with aiding the war's wounded. Despite the ship's paint scheme granting them immunity from attack, fate had dealt them a cruel hand that no white hull and Red Cross could ever spare them from. The largest hospital ship of the Allied war effort was now resting 400 feet beneath the surface of the Agean Sea, and would ultimately be recognised as the largest ship of any kind sunk during World War I. Mercifully, the quick thinking and the excellent training of the ship's complement of nurses, doctors and crew members resulted in the saving of all but 30 lives during the sinking. And while it had been a valiant effort, Bartlett's attempt to beach his ship and the subsequent breakdown of communication during the evacuation efforts had been responsible for all of the fatalities that occurred. Had the evacuation been halted, as was ordered, or had the captain simply decided against the attempt to beach his ship, all 1,066 souls aboard Britannic would have been saved. HMHS Britannic had been planned to go to sea with all the elegance and luxury of her 2 sister ships. Instead, she would never see a day as the palatial liner she was intended to be. A wartime tragedy with none of the Edwardian drama of her older sister, the Britannic's sinking failed to capture public attention the way Titanic had. Instead, when Britannic was lost, it scarcely managed to make headlines, save for a piece on the front page of the New York Times, reframing the sinking as anti-German propaganda by erroneously painting the disaster as the work of 2 U-boats and calling the sinking the latest reminder of German barbarity, whose wickedness topped even the sinking of the Lusitania. This spark of outrage failed to ignite, and the loss of Britannic would go on to be little more than a footnote in the history of the First World War.